She arrived with nothing but a leather bag, a face carved from secrets, and a past that was already hunting her. Silas Mercer had sent for a quiet woman who would ask no questions. What he got was something the frontier had never seen before. Beautiful, sharp-eyed, and terrifyingly calm, Vivian Vale scanned Dry Creek Ridge like a woman who already knew where the exits were. And when her eyes found Silas across the dusty street, she didn't smile, didn't wave. She just said his name like she'd been rehearsing it. Friends, if you've ever made a decision that changed your life completely, stay with me till the end of this story. Hit like and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, because I want to see just how far this story travels. The stagecoach was 40 minutes late. Silas Mercer stood at the edge of the boardwalk with his hat pulled low and his arms crossed over his chest, watching the road bend east toward the dry hills that marked the edge of Sulphur County. The morning had already turned against him. He'd driven the wagon into town before sunup, fed and watered the horses at the livery, and then spent the better part of an hour sitting outside Patterson's general store pretending he wasn't waiting for anything in particular. He wasn't good at pretending. Everybody in Dry Creek Ridge knew why he was standing there, and he suspected that half the town had found reasons to be on the main street that morning just to watch. Mabel Dent was sweeping a sidewalk that didn't need sweeping. Old Conrad Hatch had pulled his rocker right to the edge of the feed store porch. Even the Delano twins, who were supposedly hauling grain, had parked their wagon close enough to have a clear view. Silas didn't look at any of them. He stared at the road. He was 41 years old and had been alone for 3 years. The aloneness had started the morning he buried Ruth, and it had settled into him the way cold settles into a house after the fire goes out. Slow at first, then total. The ranch had kept running because ranches don't stop for grief. The cattle needed feeding. The fences needed mending. The horses needed working. He'd done all of it, day after day, season after season, without once stopping to ask himself whether doing it alone for the rest of his life made any sense. It had been his neighbor, a sharp-mouthed widow named Harriet Good, who had put the idea in his head. Silas Mercer, she'd said one afternoon while dropping off a pie he hadn't asked for, "You are turning into a man who talks to his own walls. You need a woman in that house before you lose what's left of yourself." He'd almost told her to keep her opinions on her own property. Instead, 3 weeks later, he'd written a letter to a placement agency in St. Louis. He still wasn't sure why. He told himself it was practical. The ranch was too much work for one man. He needed someone who could manage the house accounts, maybe handle some of the correspondence, keep the place from falling into the quiet disorder that had been creeping in at the edges. He was not looking for a companion. He was not looking for a second chance at anything. He just needed someone sensible. The stagecoach appeared around the bend with a sound like controlled catastrophe. Hooves and wheels, and the driver's voice cutting across the morning air. Silas straightened. He felt the back of his neck go hot the way it did before something happened that he couldn't predict or prevent. The stage slowed and stopped in front of the depot. Bertram Pike, who ran the depot and also served as the town's unofficial recorder of all things notable, stepped forward with his clipboard like he did for every arrival. The door opened. A man got out first, then an older woman, then a man with a hat box. Then she stepped down. Silas would later struggle to explain exactly what it was that stopped him cold. It wasn't beauty alone, though she had that. It was the way she moved. Precise. Contained. Like every step had been decided before she took it. She was dressed well. Too well for someone who'd been on a stagecoach for however many days it took to get from wherever she'd come from. Her traveling coat was dark and fitted. Her hair was done up without a strand out of place despite the journey. She carried one bag, just one, a leather satchel with worn brass buckles, and she held it close to her body with both hands like it contained something that mattered. She stepped onto the boardwalk and stopped. She looked at the street. Then she looked at the buildings. Her eyes moved like she was cataloging exits. Then she looked directly at Silas. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Not a question, a confirmation. He pulled his hat off without thinking about it. "Miss Vale." She walked toward him. Up close, she was younger than he'd expected. Late 20s, maybe 30. With dark eyes that missed nothing and a composure that felt less like serenity and more like a lid pressed firmly down over something restless. There was a faint mark on her left wrist, barely visible above the cuff of her coat, that looked like it might be a burn scar or an old rope mark. His eyes caught it for half a second before she shifted her grip on the bag. "Long journey?" he said, because he had to say something. 3 days and 2 nights, she said. The road through the hills was difficult. It usually is. She glanced past him toward the wagon. "That yours?" "Yes." "Then we can go whenever you're ready." She was already walking toward it. Silas stood there a moment looking at the space she'd just left and then followed her. Behind him, he could feel the entire main street of Dry Creek Ridge burning holes in the back of his coat. The ride back to the ranch was 6 miles. For the first 2, neither of them said a word. Silas drove the wagon. Vivian sat beside him with her bag on her lap and watched the landscape the way people watch things when they're trying to memorize them quickly. The grassland stretched out on both sides of the track, yellow-brown at this time of year, dotted with scrub juniper and the occasional weathered rock formation. The sky was wide and pale and the kind of silent that city people sometimes found disturbing. She didn't seem disturbed. She seemed to be measuring. "You didn't expect me," she said finally. He glanced at her. "What?" "You expected someone different." She wasn't accusing him of anything. She was just stating it like she'd read it off his face before he'd had time to arrange his expression. "What did you expect?" Silas thought about lying, then decided it wasn't worth the effort. "Someone plainer, I suppose. Someone who'd been through some hard years." "I've been through hard years," she said. "I can see that," he said. "I just couldn't tell from looking." She almost smiled. It was a small thing, just a slight pull at one corner of her mouth, and it vanished quickly. "That's something I've worked at," she said. He didn't ask what she meant. He wasn't sure he wanted to know yet. After another mile, she said, "Tell me about the ranch." So he did. He told her about the cattle operation, not huge, around 300 head, and the 2 ranch hands he kept on permanent, a quiet older man named Gus, who'd worked the property since before Silas had owned it, and a younger one named Cal, who was hardworking but unreliable with money and horses. He told her the house was large enough for comfort, but hadn't been properly managed in some time. He told her the books were behind because he was better with land than numbers. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "What happened to your wife?" He hadn't expected that. The question came plain and direct without the softening most people put around it, the wincing hesitation, and the careful word choices. It caught him the same way a blunt tool catches you when you're expecting something sharp. "She died," he said. "How long ago?" 3 years. Vivienne nodded. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't tilt her head and look sympathetic. She just nodded like she'd received information and filed it properly. For some reason, he found that less hard to bear than the usual response. "I won't ask you about her again," she said, "unless you bring it up." "I appreciate that," he said, and meant it. The ranch house sat on a low rise above a creek that dried up in summer and flooded every 3rd spring. It was a solid building, 2 stories, built from stone below and timber above, with a wide front porch that faced southwest and caught the afternoon light. It had been a handsome house once. The front porch still was. The rest of it was carrying the weight of years of deferred care, paint peeling along the upper windows, one shutter hanging wrong, the kitchen garden overgrown and left to whatever could survive on its own. Vivienne stood in front of it for a moment after he stopped the wagon. He watched her look at it. He couldn't tell what she was thinking. "It's solid," she said. "Bones are good," he said. "The rest has been let go." "That can be fixed," she said. Then she picked up her bag and walked toward the front door like she'd already decided. Inside, the house was clean but sparse. Silas had spent the week before her arrival in a state of uncomfortable domestic effort, scrubbing floors, dragging old furniture into better arrangements, opening windows that hadn't been opened since autumn. He was not good at this. The house looked like a man had cleaned it. Things were functional rather than warm. Vivienne walked through the front room, the kitchen, the small study off the hall where the ranch ledgers were stacked in imperfect towers. She opened a cabinet, looked at the shelves, closed it again. She walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the yard and the barn and the fences trailing off toward the pastures. Then she turned around and looked at him. "There's a room at the top of the stairs that you haven't opened." He felt something shift in his chest. "That's my business," he said. "I know it is," she said, without any judgment in it. "I'm not asking you to open it. I just want you to know that I noticed it." Silas looked at her for a long moment. You notice a great many things. I've had to, she said. He almost asked her what she meant by that, too. Instead, he took her upstairs and showed her the room he'd prepared for her, the one at the far end of the hall, with the window that looked out east. He'd put fresh linens on the bed and set a water pitcher on the dresser and done everything he could think of to make it feel like a habitable space rather than an afterthought. It probably still felt like an afterthought. He wasn't sure how to fix that. She set her bag on the floor next to the bed, not in the wardrobe, not in the corner, but right next to the bed, and looked around the room. This is fine, she said. Supper's at 6, he said. I usually cook something basic. I can show you the kitchen whenever you're ready. I'll find it, she said. Then she looked at him steadily. Mr. Mercer, I want to tell you something before we go any further. He waited. I came here honestly. My letter to the agency told the truth about who I am, my age, my background, my abilities. I know you came here looking for something simple, and I can't promise you simple. She paused. But I can promise you I will work hard. I will not be dishonest with you about the things that matter, and I will not cause you trouble I can help causing. The trouble you can't help causing, Silas said slowly. That's a conversation for another time, she said. He looked at her for another long moment. He wanted to push. He could feel the instinct to press and demand and get the thing said now, rather than waiting. But there was something about the way she held herself, not defiant, just braced, that told him she'd had this conversation before, maybe many times, and that pushing wouldn't get him anywhere useful. All right, he said. He left her to settle in and went back downstairs. So, by the third day, Vivian had reorganized the kitchen pantry, found 2 accounting errors in the ranch ledgers that had been compounding for over a year, and had a conversation with Cal that resulted in him fixing the broken spoke on the supply wagon that had been broken for 6 weeks. Silas watched this happen with a mixture of appreciation and vague unease. Gus, who was 63 and had the opinions of a much older man, had been skeptical about the whole arrangement from the moment Silas mentioned it. Mail-order bride, he'd said, shaking his head slowly in the way that Gus expressed his disapproval of most things. That's a city idea. It works fine, Silas had said. Sure it does, Gus said, until it doesn't. Now on the third morning, Gus appeared at the barn door while Silas was checking on a fence post and said without preamble, She fixed the ledgers. I know, Silas said. She also told me we've been overbuying feed for the South pasture cattle by about 15%. Silas straightened up. Is she right? Unfortunately, Gus said. Silas looked toward the house. Vivian was on the back porch, writing something in a small notebook with a pencil, moving quickly. She know her way around a ranch operation, he said. She knows her way around numbers, Gus said. Whether she knows a ranch is different. He paused. But she asked good questions. I'll give her that. Coming from Gus, this was borderline effusive. Silas turned it over in his mind as he walked back to the house. That evening after supper, which Vivian had taken over without discussion, producing something significantly better than what Silas had been eating for 3 years, she sat across from him at the kitchen table with one of the ledger books open and a cup of coffee growing cold at her elbow. You should know, she said, without looking up, that your arrangement with the Harker brothers feed operation is costing you more than it should. They've been inflating the per-pound rate on your oat purchases. Silas set down his fork. They've been doing business with this ranch for 12 years, and charging you the wrong rate for at least 4 of them. She turned the ledger and pushed it toward him, pointing to a column of figures. Compare this with the current rate board from Patterson's. The difference is small enough per purchase that it's easy to miss, but over 4 years it amounts to around $60. He looked at the figures. She was right. He leaned back. He didn't say anything for a moment. You're not surprised, she said. I'm annoyed, he said. There's a difference. What will you do about it? I'll talk to Bill Harker, he said, calmly and directly. She nodded and picked up her coffee, seemed to remember it was cold, and set it back down. That seems right. You have experience with business accounts, he said. My father's business employed a full accounting staff, she said. I spent some years working alongside them before... She stopped. I picked up a fair amount. He noticed the pause. He let it pass. Your father runs a business? He operates several businesses, she said. Her voice was neutral in a way that wasn't natural. He is, a brief pause. He is a man of considerable interests. Silas studied her face. She was looking at the ledger, but her eyes weren't moving over it anymore. You left him behind when you came out here, he said. It wasn't quite a question. She looked up and met his eyes. Yes, she said, I did. Without telling him. The smallest pause. Without asking his permission, she said. They held each other's gaze across the table. Outside, the night made its sounds. Wind in the grass, a horse shifting in the barn, a coyote somewhere in the distance working up to something. I see, Silas said. I told you there were things that were a conversation for another time, she said. You did. He picked up his fork. I'll wait until you're ready. She looked at him for a moment like she was trying to determine whether he meant it. Something in her face shifted slightly. Not relief exactly, more like a person who has been braced against a blow that didn't land. Thank you, she said quietly. 2 weeks passed. The ranch settled into a rhythm that Silas hadn't felt in years. Not since before Ruth got sick. There was something different about a house with another person in it. Not just their presence, but the sound of it. Footsteps overhead in the morning, the smell of coffee already made when he came downstairs. The distant sound of the front door opening and closing as Vivian went out to check the kitchen garden she'd started clearing and replanting. He didn't let himself think too carefully about what any of this meant. He was a practical man. Things that were useful, he accepted. Things that weren't, he set aside. But he did notice things. He noticed that she was always up before him, which meant she wasn't sleeping well or wasn't sleeping long, though she never looked exhausted. He noticed that she checked the eastern road from the front porch every morning before she did anything else. A brief stop, a scan of the horizon, and then she went inside. He noticed that the leather bag never moved from beside her bed. He'd seen it through the open doorway once when she'd left the door ajar. It sat right there at the bedside, buckles done up, like it was always ready to be grabbed on the way out the door. He told himself it wasn't his business. Then, 3 weeks after her arrival, a letter arrived. It came in the weekly mail that Patterson's General Store held for the outlying ranches. Silas had asked Cal to pick it up, along with the other ranch correspondence. He brought it back in a bundle and left it on the kitchen table. Vivian came in from the garden and sorted through it automatically, the way she'd taken over managing the mail and correspondence in the same quiet way she'd taken over the ledgers and the pantry and the kitchen. She went through the envelopes one by one, and then she stopped. Silas was at the stove with his back to her. He didn't hear her stop. He heard the sound of the envelope, the paper sound of it. And then he heard nothing, and the quality of that nothing was different enough that he turned around. She was standing with an envelope in both hands. Her face had changed. The composure was still there, the lid pressed down, but something underneath it had shifted and the change showed in her jaw and around her eyes. She was staring at the envelope like it was a thing she recognized and had hoped never to see again. The return address, as far as Silas could see from across the kitchen, was from somewhere in the east. New York, maybe. Or somewhere close. Vivian, he said. She looked up. She realized he'd seen her. The composure snapped back into place, but not fast enough to hide what had been there. It's nothing, she said. It doesn't look like nothing, he said. She set the envelope down on the table and left it there. I need some air, she said, and walked out the back door. Silas stood in the kitchen looking at the envelope on the table. He didn't pick it up. He wasn't that kind of man. But the return address was visible from where he stood, and he looked at it long enough to read the name printed in the upper left corner. Cornelius Vale. New York, New York. Her father, Etat. He found her at the fence at the far edge of the kitchen garden, her arms folded on the top rail, looking out at the south pasture where the cattle were grazing in their slow and different way. The afternoon light was coming in at a low angle, throwing long shadows across the grass. He walked up and put his arms on the fence beside her, not touching, just standing close enough to make it clear he wasn't going anywhere. You don't have to talk, he said, but I'm going to stand here anyway. She didn't answer for a while. Then she said, He found me. Your father. He has resources I underestimated. Her voice was carefully controlled. I thought I'd bought more time. What does he want? Her hands tightened on the fence rail. To bring me home. That's what he would call it. She paused. I was engaged before I left. It was not an arrangement I chose. Silas kept his eyes on the pasture. He arranged it. He sold it, she said flatly. My hand in exchange for a business arrangement with a man named Percival Holbrook. Holbrook is 54 years old and has gone through 2 wives and is looking for a third. My father determined that I would be suitable. Her voice was controlled and hollow. I was 28 and not asked. What happened when you said no? I was told that no was not a word that applied to arrangements my father made. She let out a short, humorless breath. My father, Mr. Mercer, is a man who believes that anything with his name on it belongs to him. That includes me. Silas turned to look at her. She was still staring at the pasture, her jaw set, her eyes hard. You ran, he said. I planned, she corrected. I spent 4 months arranging it, moving small amounts of money, learning the agency process, making myself disappear from the social calendar one obligation at a time so no one would notice the gap right away. For a moment, something almost fierce broke through the surface. I was very careful, but not careful enough. Apparently not. She looked at him. My father employs people who find things he's lost. He considers me a thing he's lost. The words settled between them. She'd said it plainly, without performing the pain of it, and that was somehow worse. What will you do? He said. I don't know yet, she said. I need to think. Silas looked back at the pasture. A hawk was circling over the south ridge, tight and patient, working something below. He watched it for a while. You should have told me this before, he said. I know. She didn't apologize. I was afraid if I told you the situation, you'd put me back on the next stage, east. He looked at her. You thought I'd hand you back. I thought it was possible, she said. You have a ranch to protect, a life that runs on predictability. She stopped. I am a complication you didn't ask for. Silas turned back to the pasture. He thought about all the things he could say. He thought about what the practical response was, what the sensible response was. I'm not going to put you back on any stage, he said. She turned to look at him. I'm also not going to pretend I'm not concerned, he said. Because I am. But whatever comes of that letter, we'll deal with it. Together. He paused. That's what a household is. She stared at him for a moment. Then she looked away, back at the pasture, and he could see her working to keep her face still. I need you to understand something about my father, she said. He is not a man who writes letters and then waits. He sends people. She let that sit for a moment. The letter is a warning. The people are already on their way. Silas felt the information settle into him the way cold water settles, fast and everywhere at once. Then we'd better be ready, he said. They stood at the fence for another few minutes without speaking. The hawk up on the ridge had found what it was circling and dropped. The sun was sinking. Somewhere in the pasture, a cow called, and another answered. Vivienne finally pushed back from the fence and looked at him with something he hadn't quite seen in her eyes before. Not gratitude exactly, more like the look of someone who has been bracing for a long time and is slowly trying to learn that not everything requires bracing. Mr. Mercer, she said. Silas, he said. She blinked. The smallest thing. Silas. She tried it out like a word in a language she was learning. You should know. This will not be simple. It is likely to get worse before it resolves. I know hard things, he said. I believe you, she said, and she walked back toward the house. Silas stayed at the fence for a while longer. The evening light spread low across the grass and turned the whole pasture a particular shade of gold that he hadn't really looked at in years. He looked at it now. Somewhere in the back of his mind, the locked room at the top of the stairs sat quiet. It had sat quiet for 3 years. He could feel the weight of it, the way you feel the weight of something you've stopped looking at directly, but never stopped carrying. He turned away from the pasture and walked back toward the house. The light was going and there was work still to be done. And whatever was coming from the east, it wasn't here yet. That night, for the first time in 3 years, he didn't eat supper alone. Part 2. What the Road Brings. The letter sat on the kitchen table for 2 days before Vivienne opened it. Silas didn't ask her about it. He watched her walk past it in the mornings, watched her eyes go to it, and then away. watched her pour her coffee and stand at the window with her back to the table, like the piece of paper couldn't touch her if she didn't look directly at it. He understood that kind of avoidance. He'd done the same thing with a closed door at the top of his stairs for 3 years. On the third morning, he came downstairs to find the envelope torn open and Vivian sitting at the table with the letter flat in front of her and both hands wrapped around her coffee mug. She wasn't reading it. She'd already read it. She was just sitting with what it said. He poured himself a coffee and sat down across from her without speaking. After a minute, she said, "He sent someone. Already here or on the way?" "On the way, according to this." She looked up. Her eyes were steady, but there were shadows under them that hadn't been there a week ago. "My father doesn't write letters himself. He has a man who handles his correspondence. This letter is from that man, a Mr. Aldous Crane, who serves as my father's personal secretary and general arranger of things." She paused. "The letter says that a representative of my father will be arriving in the territory within the fortnight to discuss my circumstances and assist me in returning home." "Assist you," Silas said. "That is the word used, yes." He turned his mug in his hands. "What kind of man does your father send for this kind of work?" Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "His name is Dorian Pike. He's been in my father's employ for 6 years. Before that, he worked for a private security firm in Boston." She set the letter down and smoothed it flat with one hand, a gesture that seemed more like controlling herself than anything else. "He found a woman in Georgia 3 years ago who had run from a business arrangement similar to mine. She was back in New York within a week of him arriving." She stopped. "She married the man she'd been running from 6 months later." Silas looked at her. "What happened to her?" "I don't know," Vivian said. "I stopped hearing about her." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, Gus was crossing the yard toward the barn, moving in his slow, deliberate way, stopping to look at something on the fence line before moving on. Cal's voice carried from somewhere near the water trough, talking to one of the horses the way he always did when he thought no one could hear him. "All right," Silas said. Vivian looked at him. "We have time," he said. "A fortnight, maybe more. That's time to think." He pulled the letter toward him and read it. His jaw tightened once, reading through it, but he kept his expression level. When he finished, he pushed it back to her side of the table. "Your father writes through a secretary, but every word in here sounds like a man who's used to being obeyed." "He is," she said. "He's been obeyed his entire life. By employees, by business partners, by every person who depends on him for anything." A pause. "And by me, until I stopped." "What made you stop?" She looked at the window for a moment. The morning light was coming in at an angle across the table, and it caught the side of her face, the line of her jaw, the faint shadows under her cheekbones, the small silver scar at the edge of her left temple that he'd noticed once before and hadn't asked about. "I watched my mother," she said. "She was a woman who agreed to everything he wanted, did everything she was told, gave up everything she'd wanted for herself before he came along." She stopped. "She died 2 years ago. And at her funeral, my father spent more time talking to his business associates than standing beside her casket." She said it plainly. No performance of grief, just the fact of it, which was somehow more terrible than tears would have been. "I decided I didn't want her life." Silas didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say to that. "So I left," she said. "And now he's sending someone to bring me back." She picked up her coffee, found it had gone cold, and set it down again. "I'm sorry, Silas. I know this is not what you arranged for." "Stop apologizing," he said. She blinked. "You've apologized for being here twice now," he said. "I didn't ask for a woman who would apologize for existing in my house. I asked for someone capable of running a household. You've done that. The apologies are unnecessary." She looked at him with an expression he was starting to recognize, that careful, measuring look she used when she was deciding whether to believe something. "All right," she said finally. "No more apologies." "Good," he said, and stood up to refill his coffee. Gus heard about Pike before Silas told him. Vivian had mentioned it briefly while she was out checking the water barrels, and Gus had absorbed the information with the expression of a man who wasn't surprised but wasn't pleased either. He found Silas in the barn that afternoon and stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. "She tell you what kind of man this Pike is?" Gus said. "Some of it," Silas said, not looking up from the saddle he was repairing. "Enforcer type," Gus said. "Not a lawman, a hired man." That's what she said. Gus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Her father's got money." "Yes. Money like that, the hired man he sends ain't gonna be a fool." Silas looked up. "What are you saying, Gus?" "I'm saying we should know what we're dealing with before it gets here," Gus said. "Not after." He shifted his weight. "You got any contacts in the county seat that might know something?" Silas thought about it. "Maybe. Tom Riley at the marshal's office. We've been on decent terms." "Might be worth a ride-in," Gus said. Silas considered it. "I'll go tomorrow." Gus nodded. He didn't leave right away. He stood in the doorway a moment longer, looking at the middle distance in his way that meant he had more to say but was deciding whether to say it. "She's not what I expected," Gus said finally. "I know," Silas said. "She's educated, smart, knows figures." He paused. "She also knows how to watch a room without letting on she's watching it. I noticed that first day. She's been careful her whole life," Silas said. "That kind of careful doesn't come from nothing," Gus said. "It comes from having a reason to be." He unfolded his arms and turned to go. "Just noting it." Silas turned back to the saddle. The leather was cracked at one of the skirt rings and needed working before it split all the way. He pressed his thumb into the crack and felt how deep it went. Repairable if he got to it now, not repairable if he left it another season. He thought about Vivian watching the road every morning. He thought about the bag beside her bed. He thought about a woman who had spent years watching and planning and waiting for the right moment to run, and then had run across half the country to land in a weather-beaten ranch house in Sulphur County, where the best he'd had to offer her was decent bones and a man who hadn't talked properly to another person in 3 years. He pressed his thumb deeper into the crack and kept working. He went to the county seat the following morning and was back by mid-afternoon. Vivian was on the back porch with the account books when he rode in. She watched him tie the horse and walk toward her, and she knew by the way he moved that he'd found something. "Tom Riley knows the name," Silas said, dropping into the chair across from her. He pulled his hat off and set it on his knee. "Dorian Pike. He's not wanted anywhere, which makes it worse in some ways. He's careful about staying inside the law, works the edges." "What does that mean?" "Means he won't do anything technically illegal. He'll come here, he'll be polite, he'll say all the right things." Silas looked at her directly. "And then he'll start finding legal leverage. Your father has money. That means he can hire lawyers, he can file paperwork, he can make life difficult for people who get in the way. Tom said there was a situation down in Hendricks County 2 years back, a woman in a similar situation. Pike came through, stayed 3 weeks, and by the end of it, the woman's—" He stopped. "The people who'd been helping her had a tax problem, a land survey dispute, small things, enough to make helping her more trouble than it was worth." Vivian had gone very still while he was talking. "He pressures the people around the person he's after," she said. "That's what it sounds like." "My father's strategy," she said quietly. "Don't go after the person directly. Go after everything around them until they're standing alone." Her hands had tightened slightly on the account book in her lap, though her face stayed composed. "He did it to a business rival once. I watched it happen over 2 years. By the end, the man had nothing left to fight with." Silas watched her. "Vivian," she looked up. "Is there anything else I should know before Pike gets here?" She held his gaze for a moment. Then she took a long breath and set the account book on the table beside her. "My father's name is Cornelius Vale," she said. "He controls 3 railroad expansion contracts in the Northeast, 2 shipping concerns, and a significant portion of the land bonds in 2 Western territories. He has political relationships that I cannot fully account for, but I know they extend to at least 1 sitting federal judge." She said it all steadily, without hesitation, like she'd been rehearsing when to say it. "Percival Holbrook, the man I was to marry, has a financial arrangement with my father that is contingent in part on my participation in it. My refusal costs my father not just a daughter, but a contract worth a great deal of money." She paused. "This is not about family. It is about money and leverage. It has always been about that." Silas took this in. The afternoon light was flattening across the yard, and the cattle were moving slowly in the far pasture, and it was a completely ordinary afternoon on an ordinary piece of land, and the thing she'd just told him was something out of a world so different from this one that he almost couldn't hold both of them in his mind at the same time. "A federal judge," he said. "Potentially," she said. "I don't know for certain. That complicates things." Yes, she said. It does. He looked at her for a long time. She looked back at him without flinching, waiting for whatever came next. Waiting, he realized, for the calculation. For him to add up what she'd just told him against what it would cost him to stay in this situation and to come up with the practical answer. I'm not sending you away, he said. She didn't answer immediately. Something moved across her face that she didn't quite manage to control. Silas, I heard you, he said. Federal judge, railroad contracts, professional enforcer. I heard all of it. He put his hat back on. I'm still not sending you away. She stared at him. Why? It was an honest question. Not a manipulation, not a test. She genuinely didn't understand it, which told him something about the world she'd come from. A world where people calculated their exposure and made decisions accordingly, and anyone who didn't was either a fool or lying. Because you haven't done anything wrong, he said. And because I said you had a household here. I meant it. He stood up. Now, tell me everything you know about how Dorian Pike operates, because I'd rather know what we're dealing with than not. For a moment, she just looked at him. Then she straightened and opened the account book again, though not to the accounts. Sit down, she said. This will take a while. It took most of the evening. Vivian talked and Silas listened, and he asked questions when he had them and kept quiet when he didn't. Cal had gone into town for the evening, which left just Gus eating at the other end of the kitchen table. Not pretending not to listen, but not interrupting either. By the time she'd gone through everything she knew, the tactics, the legal mechanisms, the way Pike established himself in a town before making any moves, the way her father's money worked through intermediaries to keep his name off anything traceable. The supper plates had been cleared and the lamp was low and the night had settled fully around the house. When she finished, she sat back. She looked tired in a way she didn't usually let show. You've been carrying this alone for a long time, Silas said. I've had to, she said. Not anymore, he said. Gus, who had been quiet for the better part of 2 hours, pushed back from the table and said, I know a man in Callaway who dealt with a similar situation once. Land dispute with a railroad company. He might know something useful about the legal side. He looked at Silas. Worth reaching out. Do it, Silas said. Gus nodded and took his plate to the basin and went out. The back door closed behind him. Vivian looked at the lamp for a moment, then she said, He doesn't have to get involved in this. Gus has been on this ranch for 20 years, Silas said. He'll decide what he gets involved in. She turned the empty coffee cup in her hands. Your people are loyal to you. They're decent people, he said. There's a difference. She smiled at that. Small, real, the kind that didn't ask permission. It was the most unguarded thing he'd seen from her since she'd arrived. You're different than I expected, she said. What did you expect? She thought about it. Someone colder, she said honestly. The agency profile, a widower, isolated, older, practical in his requirements. I expected someone who would be transactional. I am practical, he said. You are, she agreed. But practical isn't the same as cold. She turned the cup again. I misjudged. You were being careful, he said. Makes sense. Still, she set the cup down and stood, gathering the ledger. I'll get the kitchen. Leave it, he said. It'll be there in the morning. She paused, hand on the ledger, and looked at him like the suggestion to leave something undone was a concept she was encountering for the first time. Go to sleep, he said. You look tired. She looked like she was about to argue. Then she set the ledger down. Good night, Silas, she said. Night, he said. He listened to her footsteps go up the stairs. He listened to them pause briefly at the top, just outside the closed door at the end of the hall, and then continue down to her room. He heard her door close. He sat in the kitchen alone for a while after that. The lamp threw a low circle of light across the table and the rest of the kitchen was in shadow. Outside, the wind had picked up and was pushing through the grass with a sound like moving water. He thought about a man named Dorian Pike riding west. He thought about what it meant to have something worth defending. It had been a long time since he'd thought about that, since there had been anything that required defending beyond the basic operation of land and cattle. Something you'd tell a lie for. Something you'd stand in the road for. He wasn't sure when it had changed. Somewhere in the last 3 weeks, in the quiet accumulation of shared evenings and repaired ledgers and conversations at the fence line, something had shifted. He didn't know exactly what to call it. He just knew that the thought of Vivian Vale being loaded onto a stage by a man named Dorian Pike and shipped back east to marry a 54-year-old businessman she'd never chosen sat in his chest like a hot coal, and it had no intention of going anywhere. He got up and blew out the lamp and went to bed. He didn't sleep particularly well, but he'd slept worse. Pike arrived on a Tuesday. Silas knew he was coming before he saw him. Gus had ridden out to the east fence line that morning to check on a section that needed restringing, and he'd come back inside an hour with the kind of expression that meant he'd seen something he didn't like. "Rider on the eastern road," Gus said. "Moving slow, not a rancher." "How do you know?" "The way he sits his horse," Gus said. "Too upright, too deliberate. Man like that isn't going somewhere to work. He's going somewhere to talk." Silas set down the harness he'd been oiling. "Where's Vivian?" "Kitchen." He went inside. Vivian was at the table with the household accounts, a pencil in her hand and her reading glasses, which she'd produced from somewhere in the third week and which he'd never seen before, perched at the end of her nose. She looked up when he came in and read his face the same way she read everything, quickly and without being obvious about it. She took the glasses off. "He's here." "Probably," Silas said. Gus spotted a rider on the east road. She stood up. She didn't move toward the window. She just stood there for a moment with her hands flat on the table, very still, doing whatever it was she did when she was steadying herself. "All right," she said. "Go upstairs," Silas said. "Stay there until I come for you." She looked at him. "Silas, I need to talk to him first," he said, "without you in the room. I need to get a read on him before he knows where you are or whether you're here at all." She held his gaze for a moment, and he could see the argument forming. She was not a woman who went upstairs and waited. It went against every instinct she had, but she also understood tactics. She'd described Pike's methods to him for 2 hours. She knew how the man operated. "Fine," she said, "but don't tell him anything you don't have to." "I wasn't planning to." She picked up the account book and her glasses and went upstairs. He heard her door close, not loudly, but firmly. Silas went to the front window and waited. Pike came up the ranch road at a walk, which was itself a kind of message. A man in a hurry announces urgency. A man who walks his horse announces that he already believes he has the situation under control. He was younger than Silas had expected, somewhere around 35, lean with a pale, angular face and very light eyes that you could see from 30 feet away doing their work. He was dressed well for the territory. Dark coat, clean hat, boots that had seen real use. He wore a gun on his left hip, carried low and practical. Not a man performing danger. A man who had made a permanent, quiet arrangement with it. He stopped his horse in the yard and looked at the house, and then at Silas standing on the porch, without any particular change of expression. "Morning," Pike said. "Looking for the Mercer Ranch, some." "You found it," Silas said. Pike swung down from his horse with the smooth economy of movement that very capable people have and looped the reins over the hitching post. He came to the bottom of the porch steps and stopped. "Name's Dorian Pike," he said. "I represent the interests of a Mr. Cornelius Vale of New York. I'm looking for his daughter, Vivienne. I have reason to believe she may have come through this area." Everything in his voice was pleasant, measured, professionally reasonable. "Mail-order bride operation runs through Patterson's general store in town," Silas said. "You might try there." Pike smiled. It was a careful smile, the kind assembled to project warmth it didn't actually contain. "I have tried there. Mr. Patterson's records indicate a Vivian Vale was placed with a ranch in this area approximately 5 weeks ago." He tilted his head slightly. "This ranch." "Patterson keeps poor records," Silas said. "Perhaps," Pike said. "Still, I'd like to speak with whoever came from that placement, if you don't mind. Confirm she's not who I'm looking for. Save us both some time." Silas looked at him for a moment. Pike looked back, and behind the professional pleasantness, his pale eyes were doing their work, taking in the house, the yard, the barn, noting exits and positions the way Vivian noted rooms. "The woman I took on has already moved," Silas said. "Arrangement didn't work out. She went west about 2 weeks ago, heading toward Oregon territory, I believe." Pike absorbed this without any visible reaction. He just let a beat pass. Oregon, he said. That's what she said. Another beat. Can I ask why the arrangement didn't work out? Personal matter, Silas said. Nothing I'd discuss with a stranger. Pike nodded slowly. He looked at the house again, at the upstairs windows specifically, and then back at Silas. Mr. Mercer, I want to be straightforward with you. I'm not here to cause any trouble. Miss Vale is a young woman who left home under difficult circumstances. Her father is concerned for her safety. All I'm doing is trying to confirm her whereabouts so that her family has peace of mind. That's a kind thing, Silas said. Shame she's already gone. It is a shame, Pike agreed. He reached into his coat and produced a card, which he held out. Silas came down 2 porch steps and took it. It had Pike's name and a contact address in Denver. If you happen to think of anything that might be useful, anything she mentioned about her plans, her direction of travel, I'd be grateful if you'd reach out. I'll keep it in mind, Silas said. Pike looked at him for one more moment. The pleasantness was still in place, but something behind it had sharpened, some small adjustment in the quality of his attention. Thank you for your time, he said. He untied his horse, remounted, and turned back down the ranch road at the same deliberate walk he'd arrived at. Silas stood on the porch and watched him go until he was off the property. Then he went inside. He was halfway up the stairs when Vivian appeared at the top of them. She'd heard the whole thing. The upstairs windows faced the yard, and the front of the house carried sound up through the floorboards better than most people realized. He didn't believe you, she said. Not for a second, Silas agreed. He'll stay in town. He'll watch the roads. He'll ask questions. I know. She came down 2 steps and stopped. Did you see how he looked at the upstairs windows? I saw. He knows I'm here, she said. Not panicked, just clear-eyed and direct about it. The Patterson records would have had my name. He already knew before he wrote up. Then why come? Silas said. To see you, she said. To get a read on whether you'd be a problem. To look at the property. She sat down on the step, which was an oddly unguarded thing for her to do. She was usually so upright, so composed, and pressed her hands together between her knees. He's going to come back. The first visit was reconnaissance. The second visit will be different. Silas sat down on the step below her. They were at an odd angle to each other, her slightly above him, which wasn't how they usually talked. He found he didn't mind it. Tell me what different means, he said. She was quiet for a moment. When he came for the woman in Georgia, she said, the second visit wasn't just him. He had a local lawman with him, someone he'd spoken to in advance, someone who'd been, she paused carefully, persuaded. Persuaded how? My father has money, she said. Money is a very flexible persuader. Silas thought about Marshal Tom Riley at the county seat. Riley was a decent man. He believed that genuinely, but decent men could be leaned on, especially by someone with enough legal paper and enough cash. We don't know that he's gotten to anyone local yet, he said. We should assume he has or he will, she said. He looked at the front door, which was still open, the afternoon light coming through the screen in a warm, flat rectangle across the hallway floor. He thought about the situation from the outside, what it would look like to someone in town. A rancher who'd taken on a mail-order bride, a well-dressed man from the east asking questions, a woman with a powerful father and a contract behind her. He thought about how quickly towns formed opinions and how hard those opinions were to undo once they had. I need to go into town, he said, before he gets there and talks to people first. Vivian looked at him. What will you say? The truth, mostly, he said. That you're here, that you came through the proper arrangement, that you're my household and you're staying. He paused. People in this town know me. That counts for something. It won't count for enough against my father's money, she said. Maybe not, he said, but it's what I have. She was looking at him with that measuring expression again, the one she used when she was deciding whether to believe something was real. He was starting to find it less frustrating and more something else. Like watching someone very carefully approach something they'd been told would hurt them. You lied to him, she said. To his face, without hesitating. I did, Silas said. You'd never met him before today. I hadn't. And you lied to him anyway, she said, For me. He looked at her steadily. Yes. She turned away and looked at the front door for a moment. When she turned back, her eyes were a little too bright, and she blinked it away quickly, with the efficiency of someone who had a lot of practice, not someone I hadn't known very long chose my side without any... She stopped. Without calculating the cost first. Silas didn't know what to say to that, so he said the only thing that seemed right. Get used to it, he said. She let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. She pressed the back of her hand briefly against her mouth and then straightened up off the step. I'll come into town with you, she said. No, he said. Not yet. Not until we know how the land lies. He stood up. Stay close to the house today. Keep the windows you can see the road from. She nodded. She was already back to herself, composed, clear, the lid pressed down. But something had shifted underneath it. Something small and significant that he filed away without looking at directly. In town, Silas found that Pike had already been there. He'd visited Patterson's general store that morning, had a conversation with Conrad Hatch at the feed store, and had taken a room at the Sulphur County Hotel, which was what the building above the saloon called itself. By the time Silas came through the main street at mid-afternoon, Pike's presence had already become the primary subject of conversation. Mabel Dent stopped him outside the dry goods store with the barely suppressed excitement of someone who has obtained important information and intends to deploy it. That man asking about your bride, she said. He came through here this morning, very polite, said she was a runaway from a good family. She's not a runaway, Silas said. She's my household. He said her father was worried sick. Her father sent a hired man to collect her like a piece of property, Silas said, keeping his voice even. That's not a worried father. That's a man who doesn't accept no for an answer. He looked at Mabel directly. Vivian came here through a proper placement agency. She's been managing my household accounts and has fixed 3 years of ledger problems in 5 weeks. She's not going anywhere. Mabel looked slightly flustered by this, which was a thing Silas had almost never achieved with Mabel Dent in 15 years of knowing her. At Patterson's, the storekeeper was more direct. He asked to see the placement records, Patterson said from behind the counter. He was a thin, careful man who kept meticulous files and was proud of it. I told him those were private correspondence, and I wasn't at liberty to share them without consent of the parties involved. Thank you, Bill, Silas said. He offered me money, Patterson said, as if making sure Silas had the full picture. What did you say? I told him the records were private, Patterson said, with a slight emphasis that indicated this response had not changed regardless of the offer. He paused. He is a persuasive man, Silas. Be careful. I intend to. He found Gus's contact, the man from Callaway named Warren, who dealt with the railroad dispute, at the livery, where Warren was having a horse shod before heading back north. Warren was in his 60s, broad and weathered and economical with words, and he listened to Silas's summary of the situation with the expression of a man who had heard worse. Your woman's father has railroad money, Warren said, and land bonds in the territories from what she's told me. Warren worked his jaw. That kind of money can move land surveys, he said. I know that firsthand. They came at me through the county assessor's office. Filed a boundary dispute based on a survey that was 15 years old and contained 2 deliberate errors. He spat. Cost me 8 months and more money than I'd like to say to get it resolved. How'd you resolve it? Hired a surveyor myself, Warren said. Better than theirs. And I had 3 neighbors who'd been present when the original lines were established testify to the county board. He looked at Silas. The thing about money is it can buy paper. It can sometimes buy people. What it can't buy is everyone in a community who has known the land for decades. They tried to isolate me. I didn't let them. Silas nodded slowly. Don't let them isolate you, he said, more to himself than to Warren. That's the whole game, Warren said. Stay connected. Don't go quiet. The moment you go quiet, people fill the silence with whatever the other side is saying. Well, when Silas got home that evening, he told Vivian everything. They sat at the kitchen table the way they'd been sitting for 5 weeks now, across from each other with the lamp between them, and he went through it all. What Mabel had said, what Patterson had said, what Warren had told him about the land survey tactic. Vivian listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, He's moving faster than I expected. That concerns you. It means my father gave him a deadline, she said, or a budget. Possibly both. She traced the grain of the table with one finger, a small, distracted gesture he'd never seen from her before. He'll try the community next. He'll find the people here who are skeptical of me, the ones who thought a mail-order arrangement was odd, the ones who noticed I was too well-dressed or too educated for the part, and he'll give those doubts a shape and a story. Let him try, Silas said. She looked at him. People in this town have known me for 15 years, he said. I'm not easy to like, and I know that. But I'm known. I pay my debts. I don't make trouble. That's a form of trust. He paused. And you've been here 5 weeks. In that time, you've helped Gus work out the feed miscalculation. You've sorted the store ledgers, and you told Cal straight out that the wheel spoke on the supply wagon was dangerous before it broke and killed someone. He watched her. People notice things like that, even when they don't say so. She was quiet for a moment. You've been paying attention, she said. I always pay attention, he said. I'm just not usually talking about it. She smiled at that, and this time the smile stayed a little longer. Then it faded, and she looked back down at the table. There's something else, she said. Something I didn't tell you when we talked about all of this. I should have. He waited. There's a document, she said. My father drew up a document before I left. I found a copy of it in his study when I was planning. It's a legal instrument, or something designed to look like one, claiming that I am mentally unfit to make decisions regarding my own person or property, and that he holds custodial authority. She kept her voice level and clear. It's fraudulent. There was never any proceeding, never any court involvement. He had a lawyer draft it without my knowledge, and he had it signed by 2 witnesses who are in his employ. She paused. If Pike presents that document to a local authority who doesn't look too closely, or who has been persuaded not to, it could be used to justify removing me from this property against my will. The kitchen was quiet. Silas sat with this for a moment. Then he said carefully, You've known about this document since before you came here. Yes. And you didn't mention it. I didn't know if you'd... She stopped, started again. I didn't know if you'd still want me here if you knew the full extent of it. A fraudulent legal document is a different level of problem than an angry father. He looked at her across the table. She was meeting his eyes, and he could see the brace in her, not the same brace as when she'd been managing Pike's visit, or when the letter had arrived. This was older. This was the brace of someone waiting to be turned away. Vivian, he said, if I was going to turn you out, I would have done it 5 weeks ago when you told me about the engaged woman in Georgia. He pushed back from the table. Go to bed. In the morning, I'm going to ride to the county seat, and I'm going to have a conversation with Tom Riley about fraudulent legal documents and what the territorial law says about them. She stared at him. That's it? That's it, he said. You're not... She stopped. You're not angry? I'm frustrated that you didn't tell me sooner, he said honestly, but I understand why you didn't. He stood up. We can't fight what we don't know about. Now we know. So in the morning we start. He walked to the bottom of the stairs and stopped. He'd been meaning to do something for 3 days, and he hadn't done it, and standing there at the bottom of the stairs with the weight of everything pressing down, he realized suddenly that not doing it any longer was its own kind of problem. It was the same problem Vivian had, in a way, not the external threat, but the internal one. The thing kept locked and unexamined that ate at you from the inside. He looked up at the hallway at the top of the stairs. He walked up. He stopped in front of the closed door at the end of the hall, the room he hadn't opened in 3 years, the room that had Ruth's things in it, her sewing basket and her books and the cedar chest with the quilt she'd been making when she got sick and never finished. The room that smelled, when he'd last opened it, like her soap and her particular warmth and the unbearable specific reality of someone who was gone. He put his hand on the door handle. He stood there for a long time. Then he opened it. The air that came out was stale and cold, and it smelled like dust now, not like Ruth anymore, which was its own kind of grief. The grief of time having moved far enough that even the smell was gone. He stood in the doorway and looked at the sewing basket and the cedar chest and the books on the nightstand and the quilt folded over the back of the chair, and he let himself look at all of it without turning away. He stood there a long time. When he finally stepped back and turned around, Vivian was in the hallway. She hadn't made a sound. She was standing 10 feet away in her nightclothes with her arms crossed and her face quiet, and she looked at him with an expression that wasn't pity, He would have hated pity. But something more like recognition, like someone who understood what it cost to open a door that had been closed a long time. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him steadily, the way people look at each other when words are beside the point. He nodded once, briefly. She nodded back. He went to his room. She went to hers. The door at the end of the hall stayed open. The door at the end of the hall stayed open all night. Silas knew because he didn't sleep much, and sometime around 3 a.m, he got up and stood in his own doorway and looked down the hall, and it was still open, a rectangle of darkness that wasn't threatening anything anymore, just existing. He stood there a minute and then went back to bed. In the morning, Vivian was already downstairs when he came down. She handed him coffee without comment and went back to whatever she'd been doing at the counter, and neither of them mentioned the night before. That was the right call. Some things lose their weight when you leave them alone, and some things only need to happen once. He rode to the county seat after breakfast. Tom Riley's office was a narrow room behind the marshal's building that smelled permanently of old coffee and the particular staleness of accumulated paperwork. Riley himself was a compact, careful man in his 50s who had been doing this work long enough to be skeptical of most things by default, which Silas had always respected about him. Riley listened to the full account without interrupting. When Silas finished, Riley leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment the way he did when he was thinking something through he didn't like. "A custodial document," Riley said. "Filed where?" "That's the thing," Silas said. "As far as Vivian knows, it was never filed anywhere. Her father had it drawn up and signed, but she doesn't believe he ever submitted it to any court. He was keeping it as a tool. A tool he can produce when convenient," Riley said. "That's our thinking." Riley brought his gaze back down from the ceiling. "Silas, I'm going to be straight with you. I had a visit this morning." Silas went still. "Pike. He came in professional," Riley said. "Polite. Presented himself as a representative of a concerned family. He showed me a letter of introduction from a law firm in New York that I've since telegraphed to confirm exists, which it does." He paused. He did not present any custodial document at that meeting, but he mentioned in passing that there were legal instruments available should the situation require them. "He was testing you," Silas said. "He was," Riley agreed. "And I'll tell you what I told him, that in this territory, legal instruments from out of state carry no automatic authority, and any action regarding a resident of this county would go through my office and the county judge." He met Silas's eyes. "What I need you to understand is that the county judge is a fair man, but he is also a man who responds to paperwork. If Vale's lawyer files something that looks credible, even something fraudulent, it takes time and money to fight it." "How much time?" "Depends on how much paper they throw at it," Riley said. "Weeks, possibly. Months, if they're determined." Silas sat with that for a moment. "What can I do to get ahead of it?" Riley thought about it. If Vivian could produce any evidence of her own competency, financial records she's managed, correspondence in her own hand demonstrating clear judgment, witnesses who can speak to her character and her rational conduct, that builds a counter record before anything is filed. He paused. "And if she has any documentation of the arrangement she made to come here, the agency correspondence, the placement records, that establishes her as a person who made a deliberate, organized decision, not someone acting irrationally." Silas nodded slowly. "She has all of that." "Then start organizing it," Riley said. Don't wait for him to move first." On his way back through town, Silas stopped at the telegraph office and sent a wire to the placement agency in St. Louis requesting copies of the full correspondence record. He also stopped at Patterson's and asked Bill to write out a brief statement of the placement transaction, which Patterson did without being asked twice, in his careful clerk's handwriting, and dated and signed at the bottom. It wasn't much, but it was a start. When he got back to the ranch, Vivian was in the kitchen garden on her knees in the dirt, pulling weeds with the focused aggression of someone working out something internal. She'd changed into older clothes, and her hair was coming loose from its arrangement, and there was a streak of dirt across her left forearm. She looked, for the first time since she'd arrived, genuinely unguarded. She looked up when he came through the gate. "How bad?" "Manageable," he said, "but we need to move." He crouched down across from her in the dirt and told her what Riley had said. She listened with her hands still, the pulled weeds piled beside her knee. When he finished, she said, "He's going to file something. I know how my father thinks. He sent Pike to assess the situation, Pike has assessed it and reported back, and my father has decided that legal pressure is the appropriate next step. She looked at the weeds in her hand and then set them down. He won't stop, Silas. That's the thing I need you to understand about him. He doesn't stop. He recalculates and he tries a different approach. He has more resources and more patience than most people who go up against him, and that's how he wins. He hasn't won yet, Silas said. Not yet, she agreed. She looked at him steadily. But I want to be honest with you about what this could cost. Your land, your credit, your relationships in this town. My father has made other people's lives very difficult for much smaller reasons than this. Silas looked at her. The afternoon sun was behind her, and the kitchen garden around them was only half reclaimed, the far end still overgrown and stubborn. It had been a wreck when she'd started on it, and it was still only partway to being what she was making it, but the progress was real. He could see the difference between where she'd worked and where she hadn't. "Vivian," he said. "What?" "Do you want to stay here?" She blinked. The question had caught her off guard, which he suspected was something that didn't happen to her often. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I asked," he said. "Not whether you're safer here than somewhere else, not whether the arrangement is practical. Do you want to stay on this ranch as a permanent arrangement?" She looked at him for a long, careful moment. He could see her sorting through the question, checking it from different angles the way she checked everything, looking for the calculation behind it. "There's no calculation," he said. "I'm asking you plainly." Her jaw moved. She looked down at her hands for a moment and then back up at him. "Yes," she said. "I want to stay." "Then we're not going anywhere," he said. "And neither are you." He stood up and brushed the dirt off his knees and went inside to start organizing the paperwork Riley had suggested. Behind him, he heard the quiet resumption of weeding, the small, firm sounds of it, and he thought that was probably the closest Vivian Vale had come to saying she was home. Pochad. The next 4 days were the strangest combination of ordinary and tense that Silas could remember. The ordinary part was that the ranch kept running. Cattle needed moving to the north pasture. Gus found a section of fence that had been undermined by a wet spring and spent 2 days rebuilding it with Cal's unreliable but willing assistance. Vivian finished reclaiming the kitchen garden and started on the supply inventory that she'd been meaning to reorganize since her first week. Meals happened. Work happened. The tense part was the knowledge that Pike was still in town. He didn't come back to the ranch, but he was present the way a bad weather system is present before it arrives. In the way people looked at Silas when he came into town. In the careful quality of conversations that suggested things had been said before he got there. In the fact that old Conrad Hatch, who had always been perfectly civil to Silas for 20 years, suddenly found somewhere else to be when Silas came into the feed store. Hatch had been talked to. That was clear enough. Silas mentioned it to Gus that evening, and Gus said, without looking up from the boot he was mending, "Pike had supper with Hatch 2 nights ago, at the hotel. I heard it from the liveryman." "What would Hatch give him?" "Talk," Gus said. "History. Conrad's been in this county since before you were here. He knows who had disputes with whom, who owed money when, who had a rough patch and when. That kind of local knowledge." He paused. "He's not a bad man, Conrad. He just likes to feel important. Pike knows how to make a man feel important." Silas looked at the middle distance and said nothing. "Don't go after Conrad," Gus said, reading him accurately. "It'll look like you're trying to silence people, and that's worse." "I know," Silas said. On the 3rd day, something unexpected happened. Mabel Dent appeared at the ranch house in the mid-morning with a covered dish and a face that suggested she'd come to a decision about something and was committed to it. Vivian opened the door and they stood looking at each other across the threshold for a moment. 2 women taking each other's measure in the direct, efficient way that women do when they've decided to actually look at each other. "I brought a casserole," Mabel said, "and I want to apologize." Vivian stepped back and let her in. Silas, who was at the table with the paperwork, moved to get up and Mabel waved him back down. "Sit. I know where the kitchen is." She set the dish on the counter and turned around. "That man Pike asked me about Vivian the morning he arrived. I told him she seemed, I used the word displaced. I don't know why I said it. It was the wrong word and the wrong thing to say to a stranger about a woman I didn't know." Vivian leaned against the kitchen doorframe and looked at her. "What changed your mind?" Mabel pressed her mouth together. He came back and asked me more questions yesterday. And the questions weren't about whether you were safe or cared for. They were about whether Silas had any financial difficulties, whether the ranch had seen hard years recently, whether there had been any legal disputes over the land. She shook her head. Those aren't questions a worried father asks. Those are questions someone asks before they try to take something apart. Vivian was very still. What did you tell him? I told him Silas Mercer was the most financially reliable man in the county and that his land had been in solid order for 15 years, Mabel said crisply. And then I told him I had somewhere to be. Silas looked at Mabel with a feeling that he didn't entirely know how to express. Gratitude was part of it. The other part was something like respect for the particular kind of courage it takes to correct yourself. Thank you, Mabel, he said. Don't thank me. I should have been more careful from the start. She looked at Vivian. You're not what I expected from a mail order arrangement. No, Vivian agreed carefully. I'm probably not. That's not a criticism, Mabel said. It's an observation. She looked between them both. You have friends in this town. Don't forget that. After she left, Vivian stood in the kitchen for a moment with her arms crossed and her eyes on the covered dish. Then she said, People keep surprising me out here. Did you expect them not to? I expected them to make the sensible calculation, she said, the one that says it's easier not to get involved. Some of them will, Silas said. Conrad Hatch already did, but most people, when they see something clearly enough, decide right. She turned and looked at him. You believe that? I do, he said. Takes them a while sometimes, but yeah. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I need to write a letter. He looked at her. To my father, she said. Her voice was steady and flat and entirely decided. I've been avoiding it because I kept thinking I needed to wait for the right time or the right words. She picked up the pencil from the table. But I think the right time is now, and the right words are just the true ones. Silas pushed the paper toward her and got up to give her the space of the table. I'll be outside, he said. Silas. He stopped in the doorway. She was looking at him with an expression that had moved entirely past the guarded measuring thing. It was just direct now, open. I need you to know, when I came here, I thought I was running away from something. I didn't think I was running toward anything. She paused. I was wrong about that. He stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment. The kitchen light was on her, and she was holding the pencil, and her hair was still slightly unruly from the garden the day before, and she looked nothing like the composed, locked-down woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 5 weeks ago. Or maybe she looked exactly like her, just without the armor. I'll be outside, he said again, more gently. He went out to the barn and found something to work on and let her write her letter. That evening, he went upstairs before dark. He went into the room at the end of the hall, walked all the way in this time, not just stood in the doorway. He sat down in the chair beside the cedar chest, the one Ruth had always kept there, and he looked at the unfinished quilt folded over the back of it. The colors were faded, blues and yellows, her favorites. She'd been making it for the bed in the spare room and had gotten more than halfway through before she got too sick to continue. He sat with it for a while. He wasn't doing anything in particular, just sitting with the fact of it. The fact that she'd been here and she was gone, and the time between then and now had been 3 years of going through the motions of living without quite living, and that at some point in the last 5 weeks, something had come back into the house that he hadn't known he was missing until he heard it. He thought about what Vivian had said, running toward something. He thought about himself standing in the stagecoach road 41 years old with his arms crossed, waiting for someone practical and quiet, and what had stepped down out of that coach instead. He thought about how you could spend years building a wall against a particular kind of hurt, and then one day find that the wall was also keeping out everything else. He folded the quilt more carefully and left it on the chair. He looked around the room one more time. Then he went downstairs to help with supper. Vivian had the letter sealed and addressed and sitting on the table when he came in. She didn't reference it. He didn't ask about it. They made supper together in the kitchen the way they'd been doing for weeks now, him handling the heavier work, her managing the particulars with the precision she brought to everything, moving around each other in the small space with the practiced ease of people who had stopped being careful about taking up too much room. It wasn't smooth. He was in her way twice, and she told him so directly. He said something about the onions that she disagreed with, and she said, "Why?" And he admitted she was probably right, and she said, "Probably wasn't the same as definitely," and he told her she could handle the onions herself then, and she did. It was the most normal half hour he'd had in 3 years. Gus came in and sat down, and Cal came in late and slightly guilty looking from somewhere, and sat down without explaining himself, which was typical. They ate together around the kitchen table, all four of them, and it was loud enough and slightly argumentative enough and real enough that when Silas looked around at once, briefly, he had to look back down at his plate before his face said something he wasn't ready to say out loud yet. After supper, Vivienne put the sealed letter by the door to go out with the morning mail. Neither of them talked about what it meant, but both of them knew. The letter reached Cornelius Vale in 12 days. Vivienne knew this because on the 13th day, Pike left town. She saw him go from the front porch, not because she was watching for him specifically, but because she'd kept the habit of checking the eastern road in the mornings, and that particular morning the habit paid off. He rode past the ranch road junction at a steady pace heading back east, his horse carrying a light pack, his posture the same deliberate uprightness he'd arrived with. He didn't turn his head toward the ranch. He just rode past and kept going until the road bent around the dry hills and he was gone. She stood on the porch for a long moment after he had disappeared. Then she went inside and told Silas. He was at the kitchen table with his coffee, and he looked up when she came in, and she said, "Pike's gone." And he set the coffee down and said, "You're sure?" And she said, "I watched him ride east." And a silence settled between them that was more complicated than relief. Relief was part of it, but there was also the knowledge that a man leaving didn't mean a problem ending, and they'd both learned enough about Cornelius Vale by now to know that one departure wasn't a surrender. "We wait," Silas said. "We wait," she agreed. What came next was 3 weeks of nothing, which was almost harder than the weeks of something. The ranch kept running. Gus restrung the north fence section. Cal, in a rare episode of organizational competence, renegotiated the feed arrangement with the Harker brothers after Vivienne had prepared the comparative rate figures for him in writing, which even Cal couldn't mishandle. The kitchen garden came fully into order. The household accounts were current for the first time in years. And Silas and Vivienne circled each other in the careful way of two people who have said something true and are still working out what to do with it. He'd told her she could stay. She'd said she wanted to. Those were facts now. But facts and feelings are different animals, and neither of them was particularly practiced at the feeling part. Him because he'd spent 3 years sealing himself off from it. Her because she'd spent considerably longer being trained to suppress it. They were, in their different ways, equally unpracticed at just letting something be what it was without calculating the angles first. It was Gus, of all people, who said something. He said it to Silas one morning while they were working the north pasture, with no preamble and without looking at him, the way Gus said most things that mattered. "You're making it harder than it needs to be," Gus said. Silas didn't pretend not to know what he meant. "I know. She's not going to wait indefinitely," Gus said. "Not because she's impatient, because she's a woman who's spent her whole life being told what to do. And she made a choice to be here, and if you keep acting like you're not sure what this is, you're doing the same thing to her that everyone else did, just quieter." Silas stopped what he was doing and looked at Gus. "That's a lot of words from you." "I've been saving them," Gus said, and kept working. Silas turned it over all the way back to the house that afternoon. It sat in him through supper, through the evening, through the particular quiet of the house after 9 o'clock, when the lamp was low and the night had settled in. He sat in the kitchen after Vivienne had gone upstairs, and he turned it over and around until it wasn't complicated anymore. Until it was just the thing it was. A man who had stopped living fully, and a woman who had never been allowed to start, and the fact that here they were, side by side on the same piece of ground, and neither of them was running. He went upstairs. He knocked on her door. She opened it after a moment in her nightclothes, her hair down, which he hadn't seen before. It fell past her shoulders and made her look younger and less armored than he'd ever seen her. She looked at him without alarm, just waiting. "I have something to say," he said. "All right," she said. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I want you to know that up front. I was not a demonstrative man even when I was better at it, and 3 years of keeping mostly to myself has not improved the situation." The corner of her mouth moved. "I appreciate the disclosure." "I'm serious," he said. I'm telling you because I'd rather you know what you're getting than find out later and feel like something was misrepresented. He stopped, tried to find the plain words for it, the honest ones, the kind that weren't dressed up in anything. I'd like this to be a real marriage, not an arrangement, not a practical matter, a real one. If that's something you want. She looked at him steadily. In the low light from the lamp in her room, her face was very clear. He could see her working through it, the old habit of checking all the angles, and then he could see her stop doing that, just stop and let herself answer from whatever was underneath the habit. Yes, she said. That's what I want. He nodded. Then he said good night, and went to his room. She stood in the doorway for a moment, and then she said to the closed door, quietly and not without amusement, "Good night, Silas," and went back inside. It wasn't smooth or poetic or particularly romantic, but it was theirs, and it was real, and neither of them would have wanted it any other way. They married in the spring on a Saturday in front of the county judge and approximately half the population of Dry Creek Ridge. It was not an elaborate affair. Vivian wore the best dress she'd brought in her leather bag, a deep blue wool that had survived 3 days on a stagecoach better than anything had a right to, and she had her hair arranged in the way she used for practical occasions rather than formal ones, because she was a practical woman, and this was a practical decision made by choice, which was better than any formal occasion she'd attended in her previous life. Silas wore the good coat he'd last worn to a funeral and would now, with any luck, associate with something else going forward. Mabel Dent wept in the front row, which surprised everyone, possibly including Mabel. Gus stood beside Silas and said nothing before, during, or after the ceremony, which was exactly right. Cal appeared on time and sober, which was considered an event by itself. The judge was brief. The vows were the standard ones, which was fine, because the things that mattered had already been said in a doorway at night in plain language without ceremony. Afterward, there was food at the Pattersons' hall because Bill Patterson had quietly organized it and refused to be thanked. People came who Silas hadn't expected, including Warren from Callaway, who had ridden 3 hours to attend, and who shook Vivian's hand and said, "You picked the right piece of ground," which was, from Warren, essentially a poem. Conrad Hatch came too, which nobody had expected. He stood at the edge of things looking slightly ashamed of himself, and when Silas passed him, Hatch said, "I was foolish," and Silas said, "Forget it, Conrad." And that was that. Hatch stayed for 2 hours and ate more than his share of the food, which was probably his way of making it right. Vivian moved through the afternoon with a quality Silas hadn't seen in her before. Not the composure, which was always there, but something underneath it that wasn't braced anymore. She talked to people she barely knew and listened to things that weren't interesting and laughed once at something Mabel said. A real laugh, unguarded, and Silas was across the room when it happened, and he stopped what he was doing and just looked at her for a moment. It occurred to him then, standing in the Patterson Hall with half the county around them, that the hardest part of grief is not the losing. It's the way it convinces you that the losing was the last true thing that would ever happen to you. That everything after was just maintenance, just going through the motions of a life that had already had its meaning in it. He had believed that for 3 years. He had organized his entire existence around it without realizing that was what he was doing. And then a stagecoach had come around the eastern bend 40 minutes late, and a woman had stepped down from it with one bag and careful eyes. And she had dismantled his certainty about that so gradually and so completely that he hadn't noticed until the thing was already done. He looked away before she caught him staring. Summer came and the ranch had its best season in 6 years. The reorganized accounts, the corrected feed arrangements, the attention to the details that Silas had been too exhausted and too alone to manage, all of it compounded into a cattle operation that was tighter and more profitable than it had been since before Ruth's illness. Vivian took on the correspondence with 3 neighboring ranchers whose operations overlapped with Silas's grazing land, and where there had been low-level friction for years. She resolved it inside 2 months with a combination of direct communication and very precise land maps that she drew herself from the survey records. Gus told her she should have been a lawyer, and she said she'd considered it, and he stared at her like she'd said something genuinely alarming, and she let him sit with that for a minute before telling him she was joking. Silas was fairly sure she hadn't been joking. He didn't ask. He was happy, in the particular way that people who have been unhappy for a long time experience happiness, Not loudly, not with any sense of having arrived somewhere, but in the quiet, ongoing fact of it. In the morning coffee, in the sound of the house being inhabited, in the arguments about accounting methods and fence placement and the correct way to salt beef, which they had regularly and which neither of them won definitively. In the evenings on the front porch where they sat and looked at the southwest light, going across the pastures and sometimes talked and sometimes didn't. The locked room at the end of the hall had been properly cleared and cleaned by late spring. Vivian had offered to help, and he'd said no the first time, and yes, the second time. They'd done it together on a Saturday afternoon. Ruth's sewing basket went to a woman in town who did fine needlework and would use it properly. The books went to the church lending shelf. The cedar chest stayed because it was a good chest, and the quilt inside it was finished. Vivian had found someone to complete it, a woman named Dorothea who did piecework, and paid for it from the household accounts without asking permission, which irritated Silas for about 10 minutes before he decided she was right. The finished quilt went on the bed in the spare room, where it belonged. The room became a study. Vivian moved her account work and correspondence there, and the table was always covered with organized papers, and the pencil was always behind her ear, and the reading glasses were always either on her face or lost. And the whole room was alive in a way that sealed rooms aren't. Silas walked past it every morning and every evening, and it didn't feel like anything except a room where work happened. That was the best outcome he could have asked for. Mommed. The letter from Cornelius Vale came in October. It arrived on a Wednesday with the regular weekly mail in an envelope of heavy cream paper with a New York postmark and the return address printed in a typeface that managed to make stationery feel like a legal document. Vivian was the one who picked up the mail from the bundle Cal had brought back from Patterson's, and she stood at the kitchen table and looked at it with the same stillness she'd shown the first time. But it was different now. The fear wasn't in it, just the weight of the thing, and the knowledge that whatever was in the envelope was the last word on a chapter she'd been carrying since before she'd left New York. Silas was there. He didn't tell her to go upstairs or give her space. He sat down at the table and waited. She opened it. She read it. It didn't take long. It was not a long letter. When she finished, she set it flat on the table and smoothed it with her hand. The old gesture, the one that was about controlling herself. And then she took her hand off it and let it just sit there. "He's withdrawn the document," she said. Her voice was careful, testing the words for what they meant as she said them. "The custodial instrument. He's had it formally voided through his lawyer." Silas looked at her. "That's all?" "There's no demands," she said. "No threats." She paused. "He says he's received information that has altered his position regarding my circumstances." She turned the letter slightly so he could read it. Her finger rested on one line near the bottom, the last substantive one before the close. He read it. Then he read it again. "I am told I am to be a grandfather. I find that this information changes the calculation in ways I did not anticipate." Silas looked up. Vivienne was looking at him with an expression that was entirely unguarded now. No armor, no lid, no calculation, just her face saying the thing her mouth hadn't said yet. "Vivienne," he said. "About 4 months," she said. "I've been fairly certain for 6 weeks. I wanted to be sure before I—" She stopped. "I should have told you sooner." He sat with it for a moment. The kitchen around them was the same kitchen it always was. The window with the view of the yard, the shelf of well-organized provisions, the account books stacked neatly at the end of the table, the reading glasses sitting on top of them where she'd left them. It was all entirely ordinary and entirely different at the same time. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm healthy. I've been careful." She paused. "Are you? Is this?" "Yes," he said. "This is good." She let out a breath, the careful one, the release. "All right," she said quietly. He reached across the table and took her hand, which was not something he did often and which surprised her visibly. Her hand turned in his and held on. They sat like that for a minute. Then he looked back at the letter, at Cornelius Vale's last line. He thought about a man who had spent his daughter's whole life treating her as an asset, a contract, a manageable piece of a larger arrangement, and who had, in the end, been moved by the oldest and least strategic of human facts. A grandchild coming. Blood that was also his, arriving in a house he'd tried to dismantle, carried by a daughter he'd tried to own and lost instead. Silas didn't feel triumphant about it. He felt, if anything, a little sad for the man, for what it said about a person when the only thing that could soften them was legacy rather than love. Some people never get past that. Some people only understand what something is worth when they're afraid of losing their claim on it. He hoped, for the child's sake, that Cornelius Vale was capable of more than that. He didn't know. He supposed they'd find out. He folded the letter and set it aside. "Do you want to write back?" he asked. Vivian thought about it for a moment. "Not today," she said. "Maybe next week." She looked at the folded letter. "He's not forgiven, but I'll write to him. I'll tell him he can know this child from a distance if he behaves himself." She paused. "That's all I'm prepared to offer." "That seems right," Silas said. She almost smiled. "You always say that." "Because you're usually right," he said. She did smile at that. Then she stood up and picked up her reading glasses and her account book and went back to work, which was exactly what Silas would have expected. She wasn't a woman who sat in moments. She processed things and moved forward. He'd learned to read that not as coldness, but as its opposite, as the behavior of someone who has had to fight for everything and trust forward motion more than stillness. He sat at the table for another few minutes after she'd gone to the study. He could hear her settling in, the scrape of the chair, the faint sound of pencil on paper, the small domestic sounds of a person at work. Outside, the October light was the particular low gold of the frontier autumn, coming in across the south pasture and turning everything it touched to color without a name. The cattle were moving in the distance, slow and indifferent and permanent the way cattle are. The kitchen garden, fully reclaimed now, had been put to bed for the winter with the careful attention of someone who intended to be here to bring it back in the spring. Silas thought about what it takes to come back from a life that has narrowed itself down to maintenance. He didn't think the answer was any single thing. Not one decision, not one open door, not one letter from New York. It was the accumulation of small choices made in the right direction. Getting up in the morning and choosing to be present rather than just functional. Letting someone sit beside you at the fence. Answering a question about what you want with the true answer instead of the practical one. He thought about the room at the end of the hall, about what it had cost to open it and what it had given back. He thought about Ruth, who he had loved completely and lost, and about how loving her didn't become smaller or less true because there was now something new in the house. Love, he'd discovered, was not the kind of thing that ran out when you spent it. It was more like land. You could let it lie fallow and cold for years, and it would feel dead, and then something would get planted in it, and the ground would remember what it knew how to do. He got up and washed his coffee cup and set it on the shelf. He went out to do the afternoon work. He was halfway across the yard when Vivian appeared at the study window and knocked on the glass. He turned. She was holding up a piece of paper, the inventory list she'd been meaning to sort with him for a week. He pointed at the barn to indicate he'd be done in an hour. She held up 5 fingers impatiently. He shook his head. She held up 3. He tilted his hand in the gesture that meant maybe. She rolled her eyes and went back to her papers. He kept walking. The afternoon was cold and clean, and the sky above the south ridge was the particular clear blue that comes before the first hard frost, and the pastures ran out to the edge of it, the grass yellow and the shadows long, and the whole thing enormous and quiet and full of whatever comes next. For the first time in years, that last part didn't feel like a warning, just felt like a life. His life. Theirs. That was enough. That was more than enough.